has a number of implications. Certainly as far as the research data that we're concerned about is it's a mechanism that you can exchange and tie together many different research objects, because research objects don't stand alone. You need a data set, you need software, you need hardware, you need protocols, you need the journal article, you need the drafts, and it's, we can link them and we can look at them as a network. The difficulty is that the links are the first thing to break, and it's very difficult to maintain any real provenance and curation around that network. So in the short term, it's fabulous, but in the long term, it's a risky solution.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I mean, the ideal situation is one that is highly desirable. And so we think about linked data. That's something that every researcher wants. In my domain of computational social science, it's very difficult to replicate. I wouldn't call them experiments, but replicate analysis. I mean, that's the first step, just be able to take the same data and show that you obtain the same results using the same algorithms. So that's where linked data is tremendously valuable, but I do have my qualms about sort of the long-term feasibility of the system. I think it needs a lot of curation and a lot of time and effort invested into maintaining the proper linkages between the data. But once they're there, ideally speaking, it could be tremendously useful.
Well, even when you try to use them for things like the provenance or the workflow, because those workflows themselves call so many other routines over which you don't have control, those die. Somebody at the University of Melbourne yesterday was saying that in his field, they'll publish Galaxy workflows, which are good for about 6 months.
That's the half-life of...
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and honestly, in computer science, I always say that the half-life of a good idea is 6 months, so that might be good enough.
Right.
But it is a painful thing to realize.
Yeah.
You've got these, I mean, it's a little bit like installing a new computer system. You've got all of these dependencies that frequently you can't resolve. So I do sympathize there. I mean, I'm hoping that people will make some good progress in defining viable systems for provenance and workflow, but I'm not entirely optimistic about whether it's feasible or not. I think most researchers want to get on with their work, and will be hard-pressed to actually invest the time and effort to document their workflow and use those kind of systems properly, unless it's mandated, but then of course you pay a hefty price in terms of research productivity. At least that's sort of my expectation.
Yeah, the biomedical sciences are about the only place that you're really getting things like Taverna and such in place. And Carol Goebel's group is doing this, and with Dave DeRoy, that Workflows Forever, and they're trying to deal with some of those. But even there, it's a pretty small group that's trying to do it and are aware of how quickly those things break.
Well, I think the problem is what you have is a lot of science is explorative. So I don't think a lot of science is really sort of the old sort of Popper, hypotheses and falsification type science. A lot of science is really explorative, especially in the computational sciences. And there it's actually really, really difficult to provide a consistent documentation of your workflow, regardless of the quality of the workflow recording systems.
Well, and replicability kind of falls apart as soon as you start dealing with stochastic problems.
Yes.
And most of these things are highly stochastic.
Yes.
They're making decisions as they go, and they had no intention of going back and doing it the same way the next time.
Exactly, not to mention that a lot of the data is proprietary. You actually have to ask Twitter and Facebook to get copies, and so you never know whether the samples that they deliver to you are actually replicable, and whether the sampling software they use is actually replicable or even understandable.
Yeah.
I've got a colleague that works with Google Trends data, and they renormalize the data frequently.
Yeah.
And you have to pull all kinds of tricks, very complex tricks, to renormalize it such that it can be used, you can use longer span data. But then, of course, that would have to be documented as well. So
Well, I mean, even astronomy data gets re-released and recalibrated.
Yes.
And you've got to know what data release you've got. I mean, at least the releases are well documented, but being able to tie the pieces together turns out to be really, really complicated.
Exactly.
So the linked open data will get us just so far, but it's a way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it'll be, like everything, it's always a trade-off between the time and effort that you invest in these kind of systems and the potential benefits that you stand to reap from them.
And how long a view people are going to take. I think that's one of the frustrations for libraries, is that we like to keep things forever, and yet we have to realize that in a lot of parts of science and scholarship, forever is 6 months.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a feeling I have as well. I mean, my team and I work very hard to make sure that we document all of our data. We keep copies, but it's so difficult. I mean, servers are moved. These data files are enormous. Just to back them up is a tremendous issue. Just the backups is something that we work very hard at. So yeah, And I'm happy. I mean, I still have data around that I used for research 7 to 8 years ago, but it took a lot of time and effort to make sure that it was maintained properly.
I find it's difficult to explain to researchers the difference between backup and curation.
Yes, exactly, and that's why I said backup. And
yeah, right.
curated.
I know you were making that distinction, but a whole lot of people that we're trying to help are not able to make that distinction.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a very important one.
Yeah, we work very hard to not use proprietary formats, etc. But I can't tell you often I've asked people for the data, again, an Excel spreadsheet that has no column headers, no row, I mean, absolutely nothing. It's just a blank sheet.
But it works for them.
Well, hopefully.
In the short term?
Hopefully, there's been some famous cases recently where errors in Excel spreadsheets turn out to be catastrophical.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
It sounds like it all comes back to that question of trusting data that you touched on in the keynote.
Well, it's the question of trusting data, but I think why we got started on the linked open data is one of the ways that you can trust it is to document the provenance of where it came from. And the fact that some of the mechanisms that we have for establishing that provenance themselves are not very trustworthy or stable. So we're looking for trustworthy ways to embed trust in highly unstable environments.
Exactly. And it's in the hands of people who have absolutely or very little incentive to invest the time and effort in maintaining those systems. You have to be totally honest. I mean, I'm not advocating for laziness, but you have to look at the reality of it and understand it's an uphill battle.
Well, because the product is the paper. The product isn't the data set.
Exactly.
The paper is the science. It's the argument.
Right.
The data are means to an end.
Exactly.
So in beginning to deal with data as something that is a project. We have little critters around here, don't we?
I see that fly loves you.
Little critters that are part of the whole process. So yeah, and then we get bugs. Not just in our interview, but we get bugs in our software is part of what we're trying to deal with.
Yeah, exactly. I mentioned that as well in my keynote, that the incentives in science, right? It's true. The paper is not just the argument; it's also the thing that is evaluated and that people are evaluated upon. If I publish a lot of papers and they receive a lot of citations, that's really well, I'm not saying that that's the only thing I care about, but just publishing a data set or sharing a data set with your colleagues will get you very few research points, so to speak.
There's a few rare cases, but they are few and far between.
So it's really just the cost of the of the time and effort that you invested in making the data available, but you have very little benefit from it as an individual.
Well, it's not only a cost, but the question is the cost and the benefits go to somebody else.
Exactly.
So for you to invest the cost for some untold future other, maybe to make use of it, just does not sort of work well with human incentives.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, people have talked about data citations quite a bit. That you can actually publish a data set and then have it cited, and that could potentially increase the incentives for publishing data sets. But even then, you're publishing a data set that is essentially a gift to your colleagues to perform work that actually might bypass you and not be fully recognized.
Well, the one place the data citation is working well is the material that is contributed to repositories. That's the low-hanging fruit. If it's been well enough packaged, well enough documented to contribute to repository, then you can put a persistent identifier on it and then begin to link it. But that's a very, very small proportion of all research data. There's this big CODATA XD International Task Group, and the Research Data Alliance is working on this, Force 11, a number of others. But as a generic solution, it's not. It's a long way from being viable.
I agree. The other problem is, and it's one of my pet peeves, is that there's a difference between replication and replication, so to speak, right? If I get the same data set from someone and I replicate their analysis, I get the same results. I mean, that's a sort of a necessary but not a sufficient condition for replication. I think the more powerful is, at least in computational science, the more powerful form of replication is where you acquire another data set that is sort of functionally equivalent to the data set that another researcher acquired, and then you perform a similar analysis and get the same result. That's a much more powerful form of replication. So I think a lot of people are very much focused on obtaining data sets from colleagues and then replicating their exact analysis, but I see that only as a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition.
Well, even if you can replicate somebody else's, you can't get it published.
Well, yeah, that's the other problem.
Because nobody wants to publish replication.
No.
I mean, it's much more powerful to be able to get a similar result from a completely new set of data.
Yes.
Which again is why we're not seeing a lot of reuse. Is the scholarly payoff is in only certain cases. So in astronomy, where they've got to pool their data, in genomics, where they need to pool their data, that's where you're getting the payoffs. But in terms of taking somebody else's and doing it again,
Yeah,
zip, not a good use of time, nobody will publish it.
I
The
totally
drug
agree.
companies will do it, but sometimes it will cost them millions just to see if they can get the same result.
Right, but they've
And
got
they-
a strong incentive to
Yeah,
make sure.
but on the other hand, if they say if they find they can't reproduce it, then they've saved billions of going to clinical
Exactly.
trials. So, but those are unusual cases.
Yeah,
Even
that's not true.
the Cochrane collaboration stuff isn't a true replication.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, yeah.